Okay, so let's get started talking about oligopoly. So we've previously looked at perfect competition, which is a market where there are no barriers to entry and products are identical. So you have a lot of different competitors enter, which drives price down to marginal cost. And we've also looked at what happens when you have monopolistic competition, where products are differentiated, but you still have the case where there are no barriers to entry, and so competitors keep on entering until all profits are eliminated. Price remains above marginal cost, but profits are eliminated. That is, the variable profits are just able to cover the fixed costs of the firm. And then we also looked at sort of the opposite case, or the opposite extreme, where you have a monopoly market where there are rather substantial barriers to entry, leading to only one firm in the market. And that one firm is typically able to earn rather high profits, but this comes at the expense of consumers and at the expense of efficiency because there's this deadweight loss triangle. Today, and in the next lecture, we're going to talk about something that's sort of in between. We're going to talk about oligopoly markets, where there are some barriers to entry, which means that it's not lots of firms that enter, but rather there's only a small number of firms. More than one, but not a large number. And we're going to see that what actually happens can depend on exactly the assumptions that we make for these types of markets. So let me talk about that. Okay. So what you may have seen in your early introductory class is that if you have a market that looks like this. So here we have the inverse demand function shown here. And we have a flat marginal cost, which is just an assumption that simplifies presentation a little bit. So here's a flat marginal cost. Okay. Now we know in a perfectly competitive market, more firms will keep on entering until price is driven all the way down to marginal cost. Okay. So this is the price and corresponding quantity shown by the value on the horizontal axis that we would expect to get in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, now let's look at the monopoly case. Okay. Recall that the marginal revenue curve, it has the same intercept, but twice the slope of the inverse demand curve. Okay, so that's shown here. And a monopoly firm will produce the number of units where the marginal revenue curve is at the same point as the marginal cost, right? So it's this quantity here where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And the price that they will charge is, or the height of the inverse demand curve that corresponds to that quantity. So it's this point here. The price and quantity that occurs in an oligopoly market is essentially right here. Now, I want to take a step back because what you were told was only sort of true. Okay? That can happen in an oligopoly market or a duopoly market with two firms, but that only happens under a particular set of assumptions. So we want to understand more generally what happens in an oligopoly market under different assumptions. Okay? So we're going to look at a variety of different cases. In this lecture, we're going to look at what happens when firms choose the quantity that they want to produce and then let the market determine the price. And we're going to look at two specific subcases there as well. We're going to look at the case where the firms choose their quantities simultaneously. And although they have a pretty good guess of what the other firm is going to do, they don't actually observe how much the other firm produces. The second case that we're going to look at is the case where one of the firms basically announces how much it's going to produce first. We assume that this is a credible announcement so that the amount that they announce is the amount that they will produce. The other firm, which we will call the follower firm, observes the leader's announcements and then decides how much it's going to produce in response. Okay. Then both of these two firms, the leader firm and the follower firm, end up selling their products at the same time. So even though the leader announced incredibly committed to producing a certain quantity first, they then end up selling whatever goods that they produce in the same period that the follower sells its goods. Okay, so that's the basic setup. Okay, then in the next lecture, we're going to look at what happens when firms choose the price that they're going to charge and then sell whatever quantity is demanded at that price. And we'll look at two cases. We'll look at the classic Bertrand case where they're producing identical products, and we'll see what happens there. And then we'll look at the more nuanced case where firms produce differentiated products. By that I mean some consumers will have a slight preference for one of the brand's products over the other, all else equal, and vice versa.